Hi and welcome everyone to this episode of Breakpoint. The topic for today is SOC Beyond Automation. Our guest for today is very aptly Dr. Anton Chuvakin. He's security advisor at Office of the CISO for Google Cloud.
Somebody comes to a planet and the civilization was more developed in the past.
On the defensive side, we are very touchy about changes, and because things can be more real time.
We would say that in our experience, the most popular starter, like a beginner playbook, which included remediation in some cases, was an efficient playbook.
Have you seen that to be a better approach, to be selective with environments, to be selective with specific kind of assets?
Phishing email, again, I've seen people who take it to full auto and everything's fine. And it is humans at the very center of this.
Welcome to Breakpoint Security Podcast, folks. Join us as we explore the fascinating world of smart security teams and their cutting-edge security and engineering practices. We'll share fun and engaging stories about clever optimization techniques that scale your defenses and also keep your data safe. Tune in and be a part of the conversation where exciting innovation meets real-world application in cybersecurity. Welcome to Breakpoint, Dr. Anton.
Perfect. Thanks for having me.
So, how are you today?
It's a perfectly good day so far. I mean, it's morning here in California, so definitely still looking forward to my day.
Okay, it's great to have you. I think I've gone through I first was introduced to you through your podcast, and there have been very exciting topics there. And while I was, of course, going through your profile and your research, you've done extensive research in this area, and it only made sense to have you for this specific topic. So I was thinking, where do we start? And I was thinking from the listener's perspective. We started with physical networks, and more than a decade ago, and maybe more than that for some of the companies, we started moving out of that network. And in the recent years, many of us have been working remote, and that concept of having boundaries is completely going away in a way. And for us, particularly with many businesses going online and digitizing, the attack surface is growing as well. Which of course means we have now various sources of data for security and various sources of logs that we keep collecting for all the security events that happen from day to day. Now for these, tons of security events that we have, we need to correlate to be able to get the right kind of intelligence. Automating this correlation of security events from all of these different kind of data sources was a challenge, which is what we solved through various products that we have in the industry. But it becomes very important today because we not just want to do the security event correlation faster, almost in real time, but we also want to do it at scale for many of our companies which are mid or large sized. So while we are trying to derive these security patterns, my first question to you, Dr. Anton, is these are not very easy to find. However, there are a lot of things in event correlation that can be automated. Do you see there is a limitation to this, or all kinds of events and patterns should be automated, or there is a place beyond which we should try to make more manual correlation for this kind of data?
So I would say that when people ask me about event correlation, I have this instant and somewhat scary flashback to more than 20 years ago, because as I tried to dig out the exact date when the SIEM vendors, SIEM vendors, at the time they were not called that yet, introduced event correlation, and the date that comes up is probably something like 1998 or maybe 2001. We're talking about quarter of a century ago, which is really a bit of a scary number, because we sort of assume that security changes a lot, and we have a lot of things that are, change within a year or 2 years, and then suddenly event correlation is something that the technology providers have delivered to customers for a quarter of a century. It's measured in fractions of a century. And then we still have this as kind of a hot topic or an interesting problem to solve, or uncertainty. And that's very telling already. That's already an insight. Again, I don't have the exact date, but the very first detection rules that at SIEM, at the time they were called SIEM and SIEM, separate vendors, introduced, were probably in the late 90s. And then the rule-based correlation, where you can say, if this event happened, that's followed by this other event that happens, trigger an alert or send a signal or escalate something, is probably the very, very end of 90s, or maybe the very first 1 or 2 years of 2000s. So it's a long time ago. And I think that this applies to, strictly speaking, human written rules. So this is manual correlation. And I think that the SIEM vendors got an idea from network management vendors. Because at the time, just as you pointed out in your journey through networking, many of the early SIEM vendors were built by mimicking what the network management vendors did. I mean, I don't want to go all the way to the 80s and mention HP OpenView. And I mean, I wasn't doing IT. I was kind of in freaking school, or maybe not even born yet at the time. But the point is that this security correlation was sort of stolen or borrowed from the network management correlation, where admittedly there's a lot less uncertainty because there's no adversary. So human written rules is something that I've done personally at my first SIEM vendor job, when I had to look at data from honeypots, for example, or other type of sources, and say, oh yeah, look, attacker first broke in by doing this, and then they did this other thing. How about I write a rule that says, if I see this followed by that, I can send an alert, because it means it's not a false positive. If these two things happen in a sequence, and of course you have to take a guess at the time, and then you say, well, if it happens in the same machine, it's probably an attack. It's probably not a false positive. So this is the thought process that went through my head, and many other, SIEM designers or SIEM content developers, again, they were not called that, probably starting from the very early 2000s. And that's a kind of a scary thing. And the reason it's scary is because I've met people this year for whom this concept was novel. And they said, oh, we're not just doing matching. We're not just doing, if I see this, alert. We can do this if I see this, followed by that, and maybe count, and maybe do this. And then I'm like, yeah, there were products to do it in security for 20 years. Like, why are you surprised? Like we're not talking about anything more than that. Now, manual correlation eventually went through a bit of a journey. And the journey was that people realized that some of the rules are difficult to write. They're very fragile. By this, I mean, you can write a rule, but the attacker changes their behavior a little bit, and then the detection fails. Or you write the rules that such so broad, then the rule itself produces false positive. If I see somebody log in, then make a configuration change during the night, send an alert. No, I don't think so. I think that rule would be, in some environments, a false positive. So people try to correlate through other means. People try to look at visuals, like, again, back in the same days, maybe 20 years ago, some people try to do various visualizations and then have analysts correlate. Look, it grows and this other thing grows. It must be correlated. So that's also, innovation if your calendar says 2003. So in essence, and then there were attempts to do more automated correlation, like try to look at two data sets and see if they're correlated. That ultimately gave birth to ML-based detections after another 10 years passed. So to me, interestingly enough, correlation gives me this kind of view of the past. But here's another interesting element to this. The reason why there are people today who think this is very cool is because there was a moment when, if you are an avid reader of sci-fi, science fiction, sometimes there are civilizations that regressed in their technology. Like somebody comes to a planet, and the civilization was more developed in the past, and now it's less developed. It's supposed to be not happening, but like in sci-fi books, it does. So to me, this is what happened in SIEM. And this is where a lot of search people, a lot of people who invented kind of IT search came and said, hey, we don't need this normalized data. We don't need structure. We're just going to search. And then search they did. And it solved some problems that the older SIEM vendors had. But it absolutely buried the fact that we want to correlate. And then we sort of went backwards, and I have this blog that I would add to resources called Security Correlation Then and Now, a Sad Truth About SIEM. And this is actually, don't laugh, but this is the most popular blog I've ever written, like, period. Like, the most popular blog ever. Yeah. So, which is a weird topic, correlation, right? But it's I think even on Medium, it had like something like 700 likes or something. So the point is that it is because I pointed out that the fact that we kind of regressed. We went to search and we forgot correlation. And then people sort of reinvented it. And they were like, oh, look, you can correlate events. And I'm like, yeah. And why are you surprised about it? But these people maybe come from a slightly younger generation. They haven't seen the products of the late 90s and early 2000s that correlated just fine. And now suddenly it's like really cool again. And so to me, this is a fascinating piece of security history, because we sort of evolved and then kind of maybe devolved or evolved in a different direction, and then came back to correlation, and people say, oh, look, let's correlate. And everybody's like, yeah, that's a great idea. So sorry for rambling, but this is definitely a fun subject for me.
No, I think many of the listeners will be able to relate to what you're saying because they may also they have started earlier, or generally for all the like you mentioned, all the younger generation may not be able to correlate this or in fact relate to this, but then they know what are the possibilities that we have already explored in this journey. So while you were talking about ML, and I was just thinking in the space of threat detection that we have as of today, there is now emerging a lot of ML based use cases of how we can actually detect some of those threats, particularly the user behavior based analytics and those areas. Now, while we are talking about correlation and user behavior analysis, can we use this? So I do understand that the context will change, because you were talking about the context grows or changes, or there are a little bit of, there can be tweaks of just some kind in the attack, and that completely changes the detection, and maybe it will lead to either false positives or negatives, because it will not catch those. But in the context of machine learning or behavior-based analytics, will any of these kind of things that earlier required manual intervention and required us to provide context, can that be automated using ML, or are there limitations to that as well? Like, are there specific use cases that applies to? And I'm actually very curious about insider threats, because that has been one area which has been elusive all the time. Can these technologies then solve that for the insider threats, frauds, and other similar use cases?
I think that it's a perfect second question, because to me, at least in my experience, the first successes with ML in cybersecurity happened almost at the very tail end of the first correlation sort of journey, when people said, I'm going to write a rule that indicates that somebody is guessing a password. So how many failed attempts is password guessing? 1 million password guessing attempts is password guessing. Yeah, everybody agrees. What about 1,000? Yeah, 1,000 for sure. It's not a human. Not a human typing it very quickly. Okay, how about 10? 10. Well, I guess I've met some users who would type a password 10 times.
10 times.
Okay, what about 10 times in a minute? Who knows? So instead of facing this agonizing rule writing decisions for some rules that involve counting, people said, okay, how about I get a bulk of data of my own logs, other people's logs. I'm going to crank through all the password, all the login attempts, successes and failures, and I would learn the legitimate number of attempts, maybe how a user kind of fat fingers the password and then says, oh yeah, let me retype it, and then fails again, versus somebody guessing. This is a somewhat naive example, but ultimately ML was an attempt to avoid some of the difficult/impossible rule writing decisions by saying, hey, machine brain would tell you that in your environment, more than 7 attempts in 3 minutes is password guessing. Okay, great. Thank you. I really appreciate it. I don't want to write rules. I want you to compute the rule for me. And it kind of worked out for this example. and then people said, oh, look, I don't have to write rules at all. And then started rushing to ML. And then people said, well, no, that's not true. You have a lot of examples where a human written rule about some unusual registry entry somebody touches is much more effective than all this compute the baseline stuff. So roughly when UBA or user behavior analytics products were born, which is probably 2014, I was at Gartner at the time, and I've seen this acronym being created. So when UEBA was born, there was a period of huge excitement about ML. And there were even vendors who basically had this logo that said, no rules. Like, you're not going to write rules ever again. Of course, this was a complete and abysmal failure because ML alone didn't solve detection. ML had a degree of successes around compromised accounts, around some insider threats, around some compromised insiders, and even like traditional insiders, even though that's difficult, more difficult. But the attempts to say that rules are gone, rules are the 90s, now we have ML, they're a complete failure. And the SIM vendors who stick to no rules essentially either died, or they have to say, yeah, well, no, with a little bit of rules. And then suddenly, well, with more rules. And then suddenly SIM and UEBA combined, and the rule-based original SIM and the ML-based UEBA became one product. So to me, this is fascinating because as we go today through Gen AI excitement, there are definitely people who say, I'm going to load up all my logs in Gen AI. And I'm like, I want to remind them that that's what people try to do with ML. And ultimately, it had successes and failures. So the main piece of advice is, of course, use cases. There are use cases where human written rules work. There are use cases where threat intel works. And there are use cases where ML works. So I think the danger does not come from under or overusing one. The danger comes from confusing the optimal use case for one with another. Like if I have to move my sofa, I need a pickup truck, not a sports car. But if you say, no, sports car is better for everything, I'd be like, not to move into another house, no. And you'd be like, no, it's better for everything. Like, no, like, I'm sorry, like you can try this, but like, no, reality would slap you in the face and say, no, for moving your house to a moving furniture, sports car is not the best. But I think that there was vendors who were trying to like really over pivot to ML. But then over time, what happened is that we harmonized. We discovered this is a sweet spot for ML, this is a sweet spot for rules, this is a sweet spot for TI, and this is a sweet spot for mixing them up. Because there was one vendor that shall remain nameless that was fairly gracefully combining rules and ML. So you can say a rule, if somebody violates this anomaly, then this is followed by that, and this other statistical thing happens, trigger an alert. So to me, the success is a graceful combination of rules and statistics and ML, and in the near future, Gen AI for doing detection, but not in looking for a silver bullet like ML or Gen AI today.
Yeah, I think that again goes back to the first point that you were calling out, and I can see that way more clearly now as to, going back and forth with something until you really find the point to optimize it and use it correctly for the right use cases. So we have been talking about threat detection until now, and I wanted to touch upon the response side of things a little. So what do we do after we have detected a threat? Now, there are two aspects. One was more from an incident response side of things, where you will see that many security orchestration platforms today are also automating some bit of response, where that automation can include coordinating that incident once it has happened with the help of some playbooks. So you can define IR playbooks where these can be automated, the execution of that, and the coordination, and after you've identified, of course, the parties who are accountable or responsible for making some of those changes. and also streamline the entire response process in this whole case. Now, while we can have some set of predefined actions, do you think these are foolproof? This is a thing that's completely solved for us with respect to the IR space, the incident response space, or are there still limitations to responding to specific kind of incidents today?
So this is another fascinating question, and that's of course connected to another acronym, SOAR, SOAR. There's a funny story about SOAR. Again, during my days at Gartner, SOAR acronym was created as an acronym first because the analysts really love how it sounds.
Okay.
But it stood for something else. It had, I don't recall the original SOAR from 2015, but it did not have the security, orchestration, automation, response. It was analytics and reporting. It was something else.
Oh.
And then it was like one of those really weird stories when somebody created an acronym first, expanded it. Then in 2 years, somebody else came and said, love the acronym, but I think your meaning is shit. Let me take it out and I'll put my meaning. And so there was like a kind of like an acronym takeover story, which is kind of a fun history of SOAR element. But to me, the playbooks to resolve or even playbooks to confirm. Let's stick to confirm. Let's avoid resolution and remediation for now.
Okay.
I think the SOAR playbooks and the playbook approach is kind of established, but there's a bit of a nuance to it. And the nuance is that we also went through excitement about we're going to have playbooks for everything. We're going to automate. SOAR would solve it. Vendors and consultants and, magic fairies would write the playbooks, give them to clients. Clients would run them and would be very happy, and automation rates would go up. What actually happened is that it worked a little bit, but then the site-specific elements and the differences of deployed tools have made it more difficult. I have one EDR, you have another. My SOAR vendor wrote a playbook, and they support both of these EDRs. And I look and say, oh yeah, so your playbook mentions EDR 1, I have EDR 2, you support it, right? Vendor says, yeah, we support it. I tried the playbook in my environment, and because I have EDR 2, it doesn't support this particular system call or an API call. So my playbook does not work. I call the vendor and say, but you said you support them. And they, yeah, we support it. But I want the block executable by this API call. And they say, oh, no, blocking for the vendor we don't support.
Oh, okay.
Oh, well, okay, so wait a second. So what would you suggest I do? And it's pretty simple Python code. Go and change it. I mean, some people would be like, okay, fine, I'll change it. And other people would be like, wait a second, why am I paying you, SOAR vendor? If you want me to write Python, I'll write my own Python. I don't want to give you $1 million. And they say, well, we do provide value. We have this, we have other stuff. But ultimately, playbooks were really meant to be low code, no code, even though the word was not known at the time. But in practice, many of them immediately devolved to tweak this Python. And so when I observe today's sort of next generation SOAR vendors, some of them don't want to be called SOAR, but ultimately who say, we have low code. And then I'd be like, yeah, so did Python, so did Phantom in 2014. But the reality was you still have to go and change things. So to me, the answer is twofold. Playbooks and SOAR is how I would see most SOCs increase automation. There's no debate about it.
Okay.
Whether it's a SOAR included in SIEM, standalone SOAR. My former colleagues at Gartner recently soured a little bit on the standalone SOAR. They said it's dead. But I think they meant to say, and they explained it in doc, that the standalone SOAR purchased separately from SIEM is a niche category, and it's kind of not growing. But they do see SOAR capabilities inside SIEM to be hugely important because that's how you automate. But at the same time, the idea that canned playbooks would fix things for most clients, this idea has failed. It's very clear that the pre-computed, pre-coded, pre-created playbooks don't fit. And so either you are simplifying the playbook creation tools, or you're learning Python, or you're doing something else. In that sense, SOAR works, but the wide accessibility and utility of pre-created playbooks has not worked.
Okay.
That to me is where we are. I
Yeah,
have a
that
SOAR adoption model somewhere. I'll add it to resources. I'm kind of a big adoption maturity model fan. So there's a SOAR adoption maturity model that I've built a couple of years ago. So I'll add it to the notes as well.
yeah, that'll really help the listeners. So while you were talking about the playbooks and we were talking about the response, and I wanted to touch upon the remediation part. And I think in general we are seeing a lot of automation happening in these spaces. And with respect to remediation, it can be quite useful in large scale organizations for very straightforward remediations where we know for sure that things need to be remediated or changed in a certain way. Now, on the defensive side, we are very touchy about changes, and because specifically
Yes.
because things can be more real time, things can be in production, and they are not just the two use cases. There are things that have been there for a very long time without being touched. So those kind of things are also there. There are legacy systems and whatnot, and even when we have threat detected, which is completely accurate automatically, how far can we actually go with the response part of it where we need to change something? So for example, some of the things are very straightforward. You can quarantine some of the files, infected devices, you can reset compromised accounts and things like that. But there are cases where this is not that straightforward, where this is not limited to a single activity. It may be multiple activities or multiple controls that need to be enabled or things that need to be changed. So what's your experience in this space, Dr. Anton? What have you seen?
So I think that this is also another one of those famous questions to ask without very crisp answer. So I would go in two directions. One is, again, during my Gartner days, when people call us with questions about SOAR and the remediation topic comes up and the playbooks, we would say that in our experience, the most popular starter, like a beginner playbook, which included remediation in some cases, was a phishing playbook. And some people ran their phishing playbooks from the here's a suspicious email, here's a suspicious something, all the way to delete this email from all inboxes. And because phishing email was at the time mostly standardized, the concept of identify the same email in all employees' inboxes and just blast it to smithereens was not high risk, because ultimately you're not looking for vague phishing email. You have this email, you've run a lot of tests, and you confirmed for sure, beyond any shadow of doubt, that it's the phishing email. And then you identify the exact copy of that email. And then you go and call the, at the time, it's the Outlook APIs, Exchange APIs, and delete it. Like, in theory, this sounds safe. In practice, enough people have used it, and it was okay. But it is one example, and it's a one example where everybody in the industry kind of swarmed on, and they made it work. They absolutely made the full auto mode work. There are people who stop at delete email from some accounts, and of course, there are people who stopped at open a ticket for Exchange admin. But to me, there's a big difference between open a ticket for Exchange admin to delete email and delete 31,000 copies of that email from all of my employees' inboxes. There's a big difference.
Yeah.
And so this full auto example have run. And then back when I covered SOAR at Gartner, we had people who said, yeah, we'll do full auto, we'll do full automatic for this specific case, because when we identified with absolute certainty that this is phishing email, and we identify with absolute certainty that these are the exact copies of that email, we'll delete it. But it's one case, it's one example where a lot of very smart people thought about a lot of safety measures and cranked it up to high certainty, tweaked it for their site, tweaked it for their deployed controls, added more verification methods. A lot of them are kind of very unambiguous, like drops malware with known hash. Okay, if the email has a link and it drops malware with a known hash, sorry guys, that's a phishing email. This is malicious email, whatever. The point is that this is achieved high certainty or maybe absolute certainty. And even this one example triggered multi-year debates. So it is possible, but I hate this whole exception that proves the rule, but in this case, it's kind of an exception, but it kind of proves that the rule maybe is not a rule, because ultimately it's very difficult. Now, in cloud environments, things have changed quite a bit. So this example was from the largely on-premise world, well, even though the email may be in the cloud. But when we look at more cloud-native environments that are built from robust blueprints, they're built using the modern automation, CI/CD pipelines, everything is going through code, infrastructure as code. I've seen a lot more people do full auto for some things. This is a compromised instance. Here are the signs of compromise. We'll modify access, or we'll put it somewhere in restricted network or something. So in the cloud, it's easy to achieve certainty within your playbook. So I see more playbooks that run in full auto. But these are the two examples, is that certain specific playbooks can, in some environments, run all the way through to remediation. Again, phishing example. And in some environments, again, strictly cloud-native environments, everything is modern, I've seen playbooks that run full auto to remediation. Everything else, you're on your own, buddy. It's your risk. It's kind of, can you make it safer? Yes. Will it be absolutely safe to never, ever interfere with your CEO presentation for investors? Well, it's your call. Yeah.
But
that's kind of where we are. That's my impression.
for things like, so this actually clarifies a lot of things, but for us who are, so within an organization, for example, if we are taking call of automating some of these responses, is it easier and better to go for specific environments, for example? If not, so the case of individual clients endpoints is might be slightly different from environments where you can actually remediate things maybe in lower environments and dev environments in other places, as compared to production or other environments where every change might cost you. So have you seen that to be a better approach, to be selective with environments, to be selective with specific kind of assets?
Yes, I think that this is exactly it. Is that in you wouldn't have the general answer for follow these 5 steps and you'd have automation friendly playbook. You kind of have that. You kind of have to do that for each of the environment types, for each of the situations. There's no generic answer. I think that, I guess rather maybe the generic answer is no. But apart from that, you're looking at something that you have to run case by case. There's no one specific magical answer that you apply. So phishing email, again, I've seen people who take it to full auto and everything's fine. With other things, I've seen people take it to high degree of automation where they still call in a human at the end and say, human, confirm this. So that ends up being a way to go, where automation is 90%, but this last 10% is never achieved. I don't think that's necessarily bad. That's the environment risk tolerance. So my colleague in my Gartner days, Augusto Barros, had this example where involving automated vacuum that ran over, dog poop. And he used it in many Gartner presentations as an example of automation that just went very wrong. It's the Roomba vacuum robot running over dog poop and smearing it over the room. Like that's an actual story. And that story actually made it to official Gartner presentations as risks of automation. So you can probably still find the original post somewhere in LinkedIn. I'm not going to put that one to resources, but it's one of those risk tolerance examples that's just very vivid.
Yeah. That's funny. Thanks for sharing that. So so this is I think this is also one of the areas in threat detection. And while we're talking about detection and response, I was also thinking of the threat hunting or proactive threat detection, where this is where I think I'm playing a little bit more of a devil's advocate, and I think for many of these kind of use cases in threat hunting, we may not be able to do without automation, because largely it needs a lot of correlation. It needs a lot of real time correlation, and also for predicting threats in our ecosystem, we need to be able to correlate with anomalies. What is actually an anomaly, what is not, what's happening one after the other, like you were saying, follow the sequence of events to all these different kind of intents that we have. Where do you see the boundaries or limitations for this kind of automation, particularly for threat hunting? So will it help increase accuracy? Because with automation, that's what I think, but you can suggest if it definitely needs a combination of these, but to what degree in your experience that these work?
So I think that when I think of hunting, my first reaction is that hunting is ultimately an analyst-centric, a human-centric process. So when I hear somebody say automated threat hunting, to me that's an immediate clash of terms, because hunting is a human-centric, analyst-centric process. And I think the idea is that you kind of create a little bit of confusion, because you obviously want to have automated enrichment. You want to have a lot of automation to support. People have used UEBA, the ML type of stuff, as hunting clues. What they have is here's the vague anomaly. Hey, analyst, would you want to explore similar things or explore around it? Now with Gen AI, you can ask it to generate good hunting prompts or good hunting queries, and then you go try looking for an attacker. So the interesting bit is that there is automation in support of hunting.
Yeah.
But to me, very specifically, there's no automated hunting. Rather, automated hunting isn't hunting. Automated hunting is some other security process. Maybe it's improved detection. Maybe it's historical detection. But ultimately, if you are hunting, that means that it is an analyst-centric process, and it is humans at the very center of this. I'll add another blog that kind of compares hunting to just historical searches. But it also doesn't mean that it absolutely has to be manual. It has to be like you take a shovel and you go shovel through raw logs. No, of course not. So the automation plays a lot of critical supporting roles. So for example, I want to hunt for usernames, but some of the logs would have UUIDs or UIDs of some sort. It's in Windows. So I don't want to manually dereference the IDs to names. I want to be able to search for a name and then see something. So there is a lot of automation to prepare the data, to give me ideas, give me hints, maybe test my ideas, maybe carry over ideas from what the testers have done to sort of have red teaming examples in hunting. All that is automation plays a role, but ultimately it remains to be a human-centric process. It remains to be an analyst at the center.
Yeah. Since we were talking about the prompt generation, I just wanted to also touch upon the role of intelligence. We are talking about this everywhere today, but specifically in SOC, if we are trying to predict, or we are trying to, in fact, detect proactively any kind of threats in our environment, which are the places where we can use AI?
Sure. So this is something that's been occupying a lot of very intelligent people in the last couple of years. And you can search for, AI use cases for SOC, for security threat detection. And I think we've had, I'll try the Google Cloud blog. So now this is where kind of my day job comes into the picture, where we have the Gen AI use cases that we've tried. I mean, I think that there was one example, and I'll start with that example, where you have the malware. You get a binary. You decompile it. You throw it in Gemini, and you say, "Hey, Gemini, what this does? What are the risks? How do I disable it?" And that's an example where a lot of people didn't expect it to work, but it works absolutely brilliantly. And I think in the blog we sort of explained that somebody threw a a code from, I think it was one of the malware from a couple of years ago, and Gemini basically found the kill switch in like 30 seconds. And it took humans at the time, and it's not because it was trained on that. It was done because AI understood the logic behind the code and saw how it was done, and so it saw the way to disable it almost immediately. So a human would need to do, a very skilled human would need to do very hard work, and has done hard work to do that. But in this case, the Gen AI, without any security training, has delivered immediately. So to me, these things exist. And the use cases which are absolutely mind-blowing in terms of value and effectiveness do exist. But remember what happened with ML, remember what happened with correlation, that people got too excited and assumed now every problem is solvable by that tool. That won't happen here either. So there are certain examples where the AI gives ideas to a human implements them, or maybe AI gives suggested things like here's the query you can try, here's the report. Like a lot of this has worked and is working, and some of them there's an occasional absolutely rare gem, like this Gemini example, where it's just like immediate positive kind of shock. Like you see it and you're shocked because no way that works, and then suddenly it does. These absolutely exist, and at the same time, we still need to make an effort not to overestimate the role for AI and Gen AI specifically. Is that there would be humans doing human things, and there would be attackers using AI, and humans outsmarting attackers with AI, and humans with AI outsmarting attackers with AI, and all together.
All the
like this is all very fun. But I mean, what won't happen is that you would have AI fix my problems for me, and it goes and does it. Like that to me is either many years in the future or infinity years in the future. Like there would still be a role for humans.
Yeah, I think it's a lot in the context, and in many cases, in fact, I think in many of the questions that we were talking about, I could also correlate how the cultural impact and response will be. Like in the response point that we were talking about, it also depends on how people like their emails to be deleted or not, because there also a cultural element to what humans are doing today, and maybe tomorrow what machines would be doing. So a lot of these things play a key role in the ecosystem, and until machines understand that, I think that will not be completely automated through them. But we can definitely, as per what you're saying, and if I was to sum it up for today's episode, there are a lot of automation available for us to use smartly, but we still need to do the correlation in the larger context that we have specifically for our organizations and our systems that we have.
Yes, but also think of all the unwritten knowledge that AI may never, well, not never. I mean, may not be aware of today. You might not access. Yeah, it's I think that one of my analyst colleagues was doing a webinar, and she said that if you ask AI that is aware of your environment, what vulnerabilities you have, you probably would get a good answer. But if AI only saw 1/3 of your environment, you would get an absolutely correct answer that applies to 1/3 of the environment.
Yeah.
So it's like kind of, there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but it's just something that you would need to know before, otherwise your success turns into failure. So that's why to me that's where the differences are, is where you kind of realize, well, AI is answering magically and beautifully, but it was never fed certain data. So why would you assume that it's a true answer if it was never fed full raw information? That stuff is also very, very real.
Cool. Yeah, thanks a lot for sharing all this today with us, Dr. Anton. And it was really an engaging conversation, and a lot of things for me to learn, and a lot to ponder on as well, with all the automation and ML and other things that we talked about today. So thanks for joining us today in this episode.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for joining us today. We'll see you in the next episode. Bye-bye.